My name is Blake Moore, Natural Resources Extension Agent.
Hey, I'm Dan Severson, Ag Agent.
Hi, I'm Jake Jones, Kent County Ag Agent for the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension. Welcome to Extension 302.
Welcome to Extension 302. We are dropping knowledge, keeping Extension real, reliable, and relevant. I'm Dan Severson, and with me today is snakes. Why does it have to be snakes, Dr. Jake Jones? And I thought I saw him once, but it turned out to be a Yeti, Mr. Blake Moore. Our special guest is winner. You call this a winner? Dr. Amanda Grev, and we're going to talk about why the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Hello and welcome.
Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for having me today.
Dr. Grev joined the University of Maryland in 2019 and is a pasture management specialist at the University of Maryland's Western Maryland Research and Education Center. Originally from Minnesota, she completed her undergraduate degree at North Dakota State University with a double major in equine and animal science. The Bisons have a real good football team, and they just got knocked out of playoffs by Sam Houston State. And you know who's the coach at Sam Houston State? Casey Keeler. And Keeler used to be the football coach here at UD. But yeah, let's get back to Amanda. She also has a master's and a PhD in animal science from the University of Minnesota, where her research focused on the interaction between animal nutrition, forages, pasture management, and she's currently sitting on the board of directors for the Maryland Delaware Forage Council. Dr. Grev, you went from being a bison to a golden gopher and now a terrapin. Out of those mascots, who would win in a foot race? And please explain your answer.
That's a great question. I think I would have to say the bison because I'm pretty sure they're going to be a lot faster than the gopher or the terrapin. Also have to say, you know, they're a little bit more intimidating when it comes to mascots for sports and stuff.
Okay, I was going with the turtle, the tortoise and the hare.
True. I guess it depends what kind of race you have. You know, is this a sprint or is it a long distance marathon?
So Dr. Grev, can you tell us what the ideal pasture would look like to you?
Yeah, so that's a great question and a really good place to start. I think that the ideal pasture, of course, will depend a little bit on your individual situation, you know, what kind of livestock you have, your location, your soil type, and things like that. But as a whole, or in general, an ideal pasture is going to be one that is growing well, producing good yields of high quality forage, because that's the point of having a pasture, right? We want good forage for our livestock or our animals to eat. So, you know, the ideal pasture, besides being, you know, good yielding and high in quality, we're also going to look for things like good ground cover. So, you know, little to no overgrazing or minimal bare spots throughout the field. A good or ideal pasture will be relatively weed-free, so no toxic weeds or plants present that might cause problems for the livestock. And then we also have to think about what's going on below ground or below the surface of the soil. So we want to see, you know, good growth below ground, good root growth that can get those plants through drought or other, you know, hard times, and good healthy soils with good, you know, soil bacteria present. So we want kind of that whole picture of a healthy pasture.
And when you have a healthy pasture here in Delaware and Maryland, what are some of the species of grasses and maybe some legumes that will make up a healthy pasture?
Yeah, so it kind of gets overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people because there are really a lot of different species when it comes to grasses and legumes, and even expanding into other things like, you know, brassicas or forbs. But when it comes down to it, there are kind of a handful of ones that are more common that we see in this kind of mid-Atlantic region. And we have a lot of cool season forages here. So those are forages that grow kind of, you know, better in the cooler, wetter weather. They have a lot of growth in the spring and in the fall of the year. And some of the common ones that we see, you know, in this region are things like orchard grass, tall fescue, timothy, Kentucky bluegrass, maybe some brome grass in there. Those are a lot of the common, you know, cool season grasses. From a legume standpoint, some of our most common cool season legumes would be things like alfalfa, red clover, white clover, you know, maybe some bird's foot trefoil. Those are kind of the predominant perennial species that we see. And then you also might see, you know, as you're driving around or as you're thinking about forages for your pasture, you might see some annual forages or hear about people planting annual forages for pasture. This is becoming, you know, more of a common thing to do, having a certain area of your pasture that you plant to annual forages. Could be, you know, summer summer annual forages like a Sudan grass or a millet. And there are also, winter annuals that people use for grazing, things like triticale or crimson clover. So really, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of different species to choose from. So, it really depends a lot on your conditions and your soil type and what's going to work best for your operation.
So how many months out of the year do you expect most pastures to be able to accommodate livestock?
Yeah, so that is kind of a loaded question because it's going to be really weather dependent. In order to have a really productive pasture, one of the things that we also need to rely on is Mother Nature. We need rain to make those forages grow. But I would say in this region, usually, at least for our perennial species, we can expect to start grazing, sometime around like March or April timeframe. And we'll get a lot of growth in that spring season, again, because we have, a lot of those cool season forages here. So we'll probably have more growth than we can even use in that spring season. Those forages will probably go through just a little bit of a summer slump in the summer as things heat up. They kind of go through a little bit of a summer dormancy. We'll see a little bit less growth during those hot summer months. And then we'll see more growth happening in the fall when things cool off again, and we usually have a little bit more rain. Depending on your management and if you use any other strategies like stockpiling, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, you can extend that grazing season easily into the fall or late fall months, sometimes even into the winter if you're incorporating different forages and doing a good job with your stockpiling.
So, Dr. Grev, you mentioned weeds. Weeds are there too. They're part of the population in the pasture. What are some of the common problem weeds we have, and how can we manage these weeds in our pasture setting?
Yeah, so we get a lot of questions on different weeds that people are seeing in their pastures. And really, this fluctuates depending on the time of year. So just like our forages, have different periods where they grow better or when they're dormant, different weeds have different growth schedules as well. So, this time of year when we're kind of in the spring to starting to get into the early summer, what we're seeing out there is a lot of our winter annual weeds. So things like our common chickweed, purple dead nettle might be, the purple weed that you see out in those fields as you're driving around. We've been seeing a lot of pennycress. You might see some of the mustard species, those kind of tall growing ones with the yellow flowers. And then as we kind of reach the end of the life cycle for those winter annual weeds, we'll probably start seeing some more of the summer annuals popping up. So we have, a few of the kind of summer annual grasses like crabgrass or foxtail. That might be coming up. Some of our other summer weeds that we may start seeing a little bit more are things like lamb's quarter or pigweed showing up as the weather starts to heat up a little bit. And then, of course, we also have weeds that have kind of more of a perennial life cycle. So, these are more of a year-round presence. And we have common ones that you'll see everywhere, like dandelion or Canada thistle. Buttercup is a really common question, and a lot of people notice those pretty yellow flowers out in their field. Things like that are kind of more of the perennial species that we commonly see in this area.
What about toxic plants? Are there some toxic plants out there we should be aware of, especially dealing with livestock?
Yeah, so there are a few toxic plants that we should kind of be on the lookout for. It depends a little bit on the plant and also on the management system that you have set up. So for example, buttercup is a really common weed, like we just said, and it does have some toxic properties, but for the most part, our animals will avoid it as long as they have, other forages available. And really, this kind of holds true for a lot of our different more toxic weeds. So some of the more common kind of toxic weeds are things like Jimson weed, milkweed, nightshade, maybe poison hemlock. But again, a lot of times if we have other forages available to those animals, they'll tend to avoid it, most of the time, but not always. So I think I kind of skipped over actually management. And when it comes to management, of course, there are a lot of different ways to control weeds, both for the toxic ones and the non-toxic other weeds. But the real thing to remember is that these weeds are all very opportunistic, right? So they'll see a hole in that pasture, they'll see an opportunity, and they'll go for it. People like to say that Mother Nature doesn't like any bare earth showing, right? So really, when it comes down to it, kind of the best method for weed control is going to be outcompeting those weeds with a really healthy, dense stand of desirable forages. So if you're having a lot of weed issues and you're seeing a lot of these weeds popping up into your field, yes, you should and can look into control options, but also think about the reason behind those issues. So, is your field a little bit overgrazed? Is it in need of fertilizer or other renovations? Really, these issues are going to be needing to be corrected in order for you to fully kind of eliminate those weed problems.
Dr. Grev, can you give some indicators or signs of a good pasture versus a bad pasture?
When we think about a good pasture, I kind of alluded to this a little bit at the beginning, but a good pasture is going to be one that has good vegetative cover. So we have, thick, dense stand and not a lot of, thin areas or bare spots. A good pasture is going to be one that has a high percentage of desirable forages. So things that we want to see in our pasture, like some of those cool season grasses and legumes we talked about a little bit earlier. Good pasture is going to have, good vigor and good regrowth following a grazing bout. After those animals have maybe moved on to a different area, we get good regrowth from the area where they just grazed. And we're going to have good forage diversity. So we're going to have, a mixture of species present, some different grasses, some different legumes, and that will help, keep that pasture healthy and strong. On the flip side of that, bad pasture is going to be one that is more short, maybe overgrazed. The stand is going to be thinner, patchier. We'll probably see some bare spots. We might see some signs of soil erosion present in different areas. And a bad pasture is also going to have a much higher percentage of undesirable species or weeds. So, some of those weeds that we just listed or other undesirable species, a higher percentage of that is indicative of, a pasture that's a little bit worse for the wear.
Why is it important that we keep our pastures healthy? And can you give us some information as to why we need to look for keep our pastures in good shape?
A healthy pasture is important really because it comes down to providing good quality forage for our livestock. Again, that's really the point of why we have pasture, right? Is to be a good feed source for our livestock. So we want a lot of good quality forage for our livestock to consume. And this will help limit the need for, feeding of hay or other supplemental feeds that we might need to add. If we can provide a lot of that nutrition from the pasture itself, we won't have to purchase other, feed sources for those livestock. And the other thing for a healthy pasture is that a good healthy pasture will also have a more long-term and better integrity in the long term. So, the lifespan of that pasture will be longer. It'll be productive for a longer term. And it will really build up kind of the soil and limit things like erosion or nutrient losses that we're trying to avoid.
Whenever we're speaking about pastures and anything to deal with agriculture, there's always a lot of professional jargon that we use and buzzwords that some of the listeners who aren't heavily in the agricultural sector may not know. So what are some of the jargon that you use in reference to pasture, such as animal units, rotational grazing, stock density, stockpiling, things like that?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of terms that can get kind of confusing for people, especially if you're just getting started. So we'll go through kind of a couple of the main ones. So if we start with animal units, basically the point behind this is there are different sized animals. And we know, for example, an 800-pound cow is going to be consuming a different amount of forage than a 1,200-pound animal. So in order to standardize this, we use something called animal units. So one animal unit is basically the equivalent of a mature animal that's around 1,000 pounds. So if we have one mature 1,000-pound cow, that gives us one animal unit. If we have, a smaller animal, maybe a yearling heifer that's, 500 pounds, we'll have 0.5 animal units. And it's just a way to kind of standardize based on different sizes, different weights, so we can kind of equivalate those animals and their intake a little bit better. I think the next one that you said was rotational grazing. So rotational grazing is basically the practice of subdividing one larger field or larger pasture into smaller areas and rotating our livestock or our grazing animals through each of those smaller areas. Keep them from paddock to paddock or from area to area and keep them out of the other areas so that those other areas have a chance to rest. So it kind of, as the name applies, rotating our animals through that area. Stocking density is kind of to relate the number of animals that we have to the amount of acreage or the amount of area that we have. And there's really kind of two different terms that are tied into kind of stocking density. One is stocking rate, which is easy to confuse with stocking density, but basically stocking rate is our entire number of animals on the entire area for the entire season. So if we have a 100-acre farm and we have 80 cows on there, we have 80 animals per 100 acres. That's our total stocking rate. The stocking density is to kind of look a little bit more specifically at a time point within that entire season. Instead of the number of animals on the area across the whole season, it's the number of animals on a specific area for a specific period of time. So this is kind of more tied with that rotational grazing. As you're rotating, you may have those 80 cows on just a portion of your entire acreage. So the stocking density number will usually be a little bit higher because you're looking at just that specific moment in time compared to kind of the entire grazing season as a whole. And then finally, the other one that you had mentioned was stockpiling. And basically, stockpiling is kind of allowing our forage to accumulate in order to graze it at a later period or later on. So a lot of times, as we kind of mentioned earlier, this is done in the fall. So we can stockpile forages in the fall. We can set certain pastures aside and not graze them and allow that forage to accumulate and then graze it at a later time point. So maybe later in that fall or in the winter time after those forages have gone dormant, we'll have standing forage in that field for those livestock to graze, even though the grasses aren't actively growing anymore.
It's springtime and grass here is growing like crazy. Can you discuss some of the best management practices for our pastures? Such as mowing, baling, fertilizing, clipping, dragging. It's go time right now.
There's a lot to be done when it comes to pasture management, but I think what I'll do is kind of break it down into a few of the key kind of best management practices. So we're going to start off kind of below the soil surface. So one of the first things we want to do is look at the soil fertility. So if you're not sure, the fertility status of your soil, taking a soil test is always, the best place to start there. We know that soil fertility plays a role in a whole bunch of different factors, the root growth of our forage, the nutrient uptake, how much yield we're going to get, how long that stand is going to last. All of these things can have an impact or can be impacted by our soil fertility. So a couple of things to look at when it comes to soil fertility are the soil pH. We know that the soil pH is going to affect the availability of the other minerals. So we want to kind of keep that pH in an optimum range, which for most of our kind of cool season forages is somewhere between the 6 and 7 pH range. And then we're going to take a look at that soil test that we've done, and we're going to see what of the other nutrients are limiting or low in supply, and we're going to supply those nutrients as needed. Some of the common nutrients are things like phosphorus, potassium, but it's really important to see the status of our soil so we know whether or not we need to apply those nutrients. And then for pasture in particular and for grazing, one of the advantages is we know that a lot of our soil nutrients are recycled through those animals. So those animals are consuming nutrients as they consume that forage, and they're recycling that back out in their manure and their urine. But another question is, how uniformly are they distributing those nutrients across the field? They've done studies that have looked at, the distribution of manure across a field, and in a continuous grazing system, it can take 20 plus years to get a manure pile or a redistribution of manure across every square yard in that field. But this can be decreased substantially if we're using some of those good practices like rotational grazing. We can get that down to, only a year or two to get one manure pile per square yard. So that's really the second kind of key thing, is using something like rotational grazing. We already kind of defined rotational grazing, but we're controlling the amount of time that the animals spend in that one given area so that in the rest of the areas, the forages, the water, the soil can all have time to recover, regrow, rejuvenate. And this also, gives us that advantage of having a little bit more even grazing, a little bit more even manure distribution. The third kind of key is, allowing for adequate rest, which goes kind of hand in hand with rotational grazing in a continuous system. So where the animals have access to the entire field kind of for that entire time or entire season, those animals are going to kind of go back and repeatedly graze a lot of the plants every, 3 to 7 days. And this is really detrimental for the health of that plant. So what we really need to do is allow those plants time to rest by using rotational grazing. And this gives them the time that they need to kind of regenerate their carbohydrate reserves, allow the roots to regenerate and redevelop so those plants can remain strong and continue growing throughout the season. You mentioned, things like mowing or clipping. So one of the other kind of keys, especially this time of year, is to try and keep our pastures in more of a vegetative state. So less mature, more leafy. Those forages are going to be higher in quality if they are kept kind of more in that vegetative or actively growing state. And we know that, animal preferences vary, and this often results in different variations throughout the field. So you can use things like mowing or clipping to help keep your pastures in that vegetative state and help keep them kind of actively growing. If you have, more forage than you can handle, especially, again, this time of year when things are growing really rapidly, some people like to set aside, a pasture or a field or two and actually make one cutting of hay off of that field, bale that forage up and save it for, later use to kind of help them stay on top of the rapidly growing forages. And then the final thing that, I'd like everyone to kind of keep in mind is making sure that we're keeping some, green leaf material there in the field. Really when it's time for regrowth, plants get their energy for regrowth from kind of one of two main areas. So we have the amount of leaf area remaining on that plant that can continue to photosynthesize and produce energy for that plant. And we have stored carbohydrates in that plant. So if we're grazing our forages really low, or we're cutting our forages really low with a mower, there's not only less leaf material remaining in that field for photosynthesis, but there's also less stored carbohydrates remaining. A lot of those cool season forages store much of their carbohydrates in the lower, 3 or 4 inches of the stem. So if we're eating that forage down to the dirt, we're really depleting that plant of its energy source. So if we use a little bit higher grazing height, we leave a little bit more in the field. There's going to be a little bit more leaf area remaining for photosynthesis. There's going to be a little bit more stored carbohydrates remaining, and those plants are going to really bounce back faster and be healthier and more productive kind of in the long term. So that's where you hear that kind of, rule of thumb when it comes to grazing, take half, leave half, or, takes grass to grow grass. Those kinds of sayings are ways to remind people that, we really don't want to be overgrazing or grazing our fields too short.
And that's a good reason to know what you're actually have in your pasture as far as your species, because growing points are different between species, legumes, and grasses, correct?
Exactly. Yep. So, legumes like alfalfa tend to store kind of more of their energy down in the roots. So, if you have, an all alfalfa hay field, you can cut that field a little bit lower compared to something like a cool season grass like orchard grass, which really relies on the base of that stem as the storage point for that plant. So it's important to know, like Dan said, what species we have and how we need to manage those species appropriately so they will succeed.
We know how in agriculture, how important that is. How often do you recommend pasture management to do a soil test? And if they do it every several years, are there some visual signs that your pH is off, since that's so important?
The answer will vary a little bit on kind of if you're just getting going in the management process and kind of working towards building things up, or if you really have it kind of, an established routine and a rhythm down. So soil testing you can do, as often as you'd like. Most people do somewhere between every year to every 3 years. So if you have, like I said, an established field, it's, been productive, it's doing pretty well, and you want to soil test, every couple of years just to kind of check on things, that is, perfectly acceptable. If you have a field that you're trying to renovate, you're trying to kind of, increase the production of that field, you might want to keep a little bit closer an eye on it and do it, maybe every year, just for a little while, or at least to start with. And then, for other things that you can kind of keep an eye on in between, like I said, that there are different, visual cues that we can look at in a pasture. How well that pasture is producing is a good indicator. If we have areas of the field that are turning really yellow, that can be an indicator of, a lack of nitrogen supply to those forages. There are, signs that we can look for specific deficiencies if we're worried about a given thing.
And is there any particular plants that show up if like the pH is low, if you have an acidic soil?
Yeah, so that's another thing where, we talked about, weed management and weed control. A lot of our weeds or kind of more undesirable forages thrive or do better at, a lower soil pH or a lower soil fertility. So where something, desirable like orchard grass might not be able to thrive, some of those weeds can do well at a low pH. For example, we mentioned buttercup earlier. Buttercup is a forage or a weed that tends to do well on more of a poor fertility soil or an overgrazed soil. So that can be an indicator. Another common one that we may see is something like broom sedge. Broom sedge does well also on a lower pH soil or a more poor fertility soil. So if you're seeing a lot of those kind of weeds or weedy grasses showing up, that can be a clue that you need to be doing some checking on your soil fertility.
By now, I'm sure listeners are thinking about their own pastures and deciding whether or not they're falling in a healthy or unhealthy type of category. So can you give us an idea of how to know if your pasture needs renovation, and then describe the process of renovating your pasture?
Kind of to start off, really there are a few really common causes for low productivity. One is a lack of adequate fertility, which we kind of just talked about. Another is poor grazing management, which we've also kind of talked about a little bit. And the third is kind of unproductive species. So you don't have kind of the right species to thrive in your environment or your soil type. But, referring back to kind of what we said earlier, when it comes to renovation, this can mean, reseeding or, kind of redoing a pasture, but it can also mean, just making improvements in our management. So if our pasture is not doing well because we're using poor grazing management, changing that alone can really help, renovate that field and get it back to kind of a more productive state. So again, keep in mind, why, or some of the reasons behind why you may be thinking your pasture needs some renovation and what may be causing that. When it comes to deciding, if it's time to renovate or not, there are some methods that we can use to kind of assess the condition of our fields. I highly suggest using something that's more quantifiable or, measurable, where you can assign, a number or a score to that field. And that allows you to kind of, do that assessment on several different fields and maybe compare them against each other, see which one is the worst, etc. So a couple of the options for kind of different methods that we can look at are something called the step point method, which you may have heard of before, but if you haven't, basically this involves walking through each pasture in kind of a random zigzag pattern and noting what species is growing, or, if there's a bare spot, that there's bare dirt at different locations throughout the pasture. So, for example, you zigzag your way across the field and say every 20 steps, you stop and look down at the toe of your shoe and make a note of what exact forage species is growing there. Is it a white clover plant? Is it an orchard grass? Is it a weed? Is it a bare spot? And you do this for, say, 100 different places throughout the field. And you can actually calculate the percentage then of desirable forage species, the percentage of, weed spots, the percentage of bare dirt, and get an idea of kind of the cover throughout that field. Another common guide or, measure for assessment that a lot of people like to look at is the NRCS has something called the Guide to Pasture Condition Scoring. And this includes, something similar to the step point method, where it looks at, the plant cover and the percent of desirable forages in that field. But it also includes things like plant diversity, the vigor of that field, the percentage of legumes or different forages, signs for erosion. There's kind of 10 different indicators, and there's scoring on there. So you can score each of your fields for each of those 10 different indicators and come up with a final score and kind of make that decision if that field is going to need some renovation or not.
I like that way of thinking. If you change your practices, it can be considered a renovation, because when I was asking the question, I was thinking of like a dramatic reseeding and everything. But I like that if you just change some of your management practices, it can actually benefit the pasture pretty easily.
Yeah. A little bit of good management can really go a long way. And, of course, there are times when we do need that full kind of reseeding or that kind of big renovation process to happen periodically. This is a thing to do. So when it does come time to do that actual renovation process, kind of there's several steps that you kind of want to go through and check off your list as you're going through the renovation process. First and foremost would be to check the soil fertility. Again, that's kind of a big underlying cause for a lot of things. So if it is off, we want to correct that before we're planting, our new pasture or new seeding into that, because that's going to affect how those seedlings are going to grow. So that's always the first thing to check. The second thing is to look at weeds. If we need to control some weeds or do some weed control measures before we get to the seeding stage, that's important because, again, we don't want those weeds to outcompete those new seedlings. We want to give those seedlings the best opportunity that we can for them to grow and thrive in that field. Selecting, well-adapted species is important. So when it comes time to renovation and you're looking at options for things to plant, we really want to kind of match the forages and their different growth types to our soil and our site characteristics. And it can be a little bit overwhelming to try to do, but it's an important thing to really consider as we're choosing forage species for our different pastures or our different fields. When it comes time to the actual seeding to happen, one of the things that's really important, especially if you're using a no-till seeding or using a no-till drill, is to graze or clip that field really closely or really tightly to kind of suppress that existing vegetation. So I always kind of chuckle a little bit when I say that, because this is really the only time you'll ever hear, a forage specialist or a pasture person say to overgraze or clip something close. But the point of that is to kind of suppress what's there so we can, again, offer opportunity for those new seedlings to grow and to thrive in that field. If you're using a tillage or more of a conventionally prepared seed bed, then of course you want to be sure to prepare the proper seed bed. We want that soil to be firm, not overworked, not too many clods, but not too soft. Kind of find that nice, like happy medium balance for that. And then for seeding, they always say, things like seed at the proper time, seed at the proper rate, seed at the proper depth. So it's really important that we're, looking at the timing, for our mid-Atlantic region, when we're looking at cool season forages, at least usually kind of the best time to seed is sometime in that mid-August to mid-September time frame, maybe a little bit earlier, kind of if you're more, Southern Maryland on the shore, over that way, a little bit on the later side if you're more towards, the western side of the region. And then for the proper rate and the proper depth, that all comes down to drill calibration. So, choose the proper rate depending on what you're going to plant, and make sure you're calibrating that drill. Don't just go by, the chart that says, a recommendation, because there is so much variability in seed size, seed weight, seed coatings. So really it's important to check the drill and make sure that we're calibrating that for both seeding rate and seeding depth. And then the final step is to manage it once we've established it. So, if you seed a new field and, 4 weeks later you see some growth out there and you decide to turn your livestock out on that field to graze, those seedlings aren't going to do very well, and they're not going to last very long because they haven't had time to really establish and set down good roots. So we really need to manage carefully that new seeding and that established seeding, and let those forages grow and really get some good roots established well in advance of letting animals graze that field.
Pastures are a living resource, and it seems like, throughout this podcast, we've mentioned that, with proper management, with the proper timing on management, there's a certain resiliency there that helps pastures last longer than they might if the timing's off. We've also talked about how Mother Nature has a lot to do with it. So, each year is going to be different, whether it's precipitation, whether it's temperature, all of those different types of things. So where is it that pasture managers can go to find out up-to-date information on when they should be doing what?
So when it comes to kind of timely resources, that's where you can start to look to kind of your local extension office, kind of rely on your extension agents as a resource. If you're looking for kind of more printed things, I know both the University of Maryland Extension and the University of Delaware Extension submits or puts out several newsletters that have kind of timely articles depending on the month or the week or the time of year. I also manage a Facebook page that's called Maryland Forages, and I try to post timely tips on the Facebook page. So things you should be doing kind of at different times of the year, considerations and other suggestions or, helpful information on there. So there's a lot of different resources that you can look to in extension and in other ways.
Dr. Greb, if you're not a very good pasture manager, I know the Maryland Delaware Forage Council has a hay directory that you can go to possibly purchase hay, or maybe if you become a member, you can list hay. Is that correct? And can you give us any take-home messages to wrap this up?
The Maryland Delaware Forage Council is another great resource. They have a website online where, they post newsletter articles and also, other timely information. And we did just start a hay directory on the website. So we will have, hay listings, hay that's available for sale posted on there. And if you're a member of the council, you are able to list your hay or post your hay as an option for selling it, for looking for customers. So that's a really great resource. And then again, of course, your local extension office, the University of Maryland actually just redid their entire extension website. And we now have a forage extension page that myself and several others are managing. So it's brand new. There is some content on there, but we will be adding a lot more, in the upcoming months. So check that out as a resource. And I mentioned the Maryland Forages page on Facebook. There's also a YouTube channel that's associated with that, where we have videos from, past webinars, forage conferences, different things as a source for kind of helpful information and a resource for you to use as you would like. And then when it comes to a summary or take-home message, I guess I would say that good pasture management really does require good management. You can't just, leave it and expect it to grow and continue to do well all on its own. And if you could kind of wrap everything that we said, up into 3 kind of main keys or 3 takeaways, I would say ensure that you have good soil fertility and that you're supplying those nutrients that is needed to those plants. Use some sort of rotational grazing that allows those pastures to rest and helps, in multiple other ways. And then finally, make sure that you're not overgrazing or grazing those forages too short, but that you're leaving enough residual matter for those forages to be able to continue to photosynthesize and regrow quickly. So that's kind of the summary. If you could put pasture management in a nutshell, that's what I would say.
Well, thank you. It seems like an awful lot goes into growing grass, and there's definitely not a lack of information out there for everybody who wants to learn how to do it and do it properly from what you've listed. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Blake, Jake, anything to add?
Thank you for joining us. This was excellent. I've always learned something new every time we do a podcast, and I'm hoping our listeners do the same.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode and will join us next time. In the meantime, visit us online at udel.edu/extension, join our mailing list, and join us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at UD Extension. This program is brought to you by the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension, a service of the UD College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, a land-grant institution. This institution is an equal opportunity provider.